Okay, everybody here? Okay. Can you hear us? Yes. Okay, good evening. My name's Eduardo Cadava, and I'm presently the chair of the Edward W. Said Class of 57 Memorial Lecture Committee. And on behalf of the committee, the Department of English, and the student-run Princeton Committee on Palestine, I would like to welcome you to the 7th annual lecture in our series. This year we are honored and pleased that Professor Noam Chomsky has kindly agreed to be with us tonight. Before introducing him, I'd like to offer a few thanks and to say a few words about the lecture series. First of all, I'd like to thank the members of the lecture committee, and especially Zia Mian for the role he played in Professor Chomsky's kind acceptance of our invitation, and the students on the Princeton Committee on Palestine, especially Yoel Bitran, the current president of the PCP, and Sarah Musa for everything they've done to make this event possible. Thank you. Although this is the 7th lecture in our series, this is only the 2nd year that the lecture has been supported by endowed funds. And so I also wish to thank Samar Younes, Nabil Kadumi, and Carl Chastanet for their very generous and kind support. We're especially pleased that Mr. Chastanet is able to be here with us tonight, and I think he's right here, yes. So thank you. We owe him and our other donors a felt debt for facilitating this year's lecture and for helping secure the series' future. I'd also like to acknowledge Miriam Saeed's presence here tonight. It's right here. And to thank her for her ongoing support. The lecture series was begun in 2003 by the student-run Princeton Committee on Palestine in order to honor and give tribute to Edward Said's work and life, both of which have been and still are so present for so many of us. As we know, memorials of any kind are as much about the future as they are about the past, and it is in this context that the example of Edward remains still today such a model and inspiration, not only for those of us in literature and the humanities, but also for those of us who remain committed to a future that will not simply be the repetition of the past. Taking his point of departure from Adorno, Edward once wrote that the main hope of the intellectual is not that he will have an effect on the world, but that someday, somewhere, someone will recall what he wrote exactly as he wrote it. In an interview, he explains that he borrowed this idea from Adorno at a time when he felt that things were going very badly for the Palestinians, and that being left out of the progress of history was a fate he didn't wish to settle for. What I felt that I could at least do was to testify, he says, to be a witness to a certain kind of history and to get it right. I think in the end that is probably the most fundamental challenge of all, to try to get it right, to find words that will fit a situation and that will not change as the situation changes, but which will at least register a reaction to a particular moment that would otherwise go by, end quote. The passion that motivated what Edward wrote about Palestine and its people emerged from his sense of the distance between Palestinian reality and the distortions of that reality that have been and continue to be so present in Western public discourse. This is what encouraged him to try again and again to get it right. This is also, I think, what often has motivated the courage, determination, and commitment of Noam Chomsky's long-standing interest in describing the daily effects of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict on the Palestinian people, but also the suffering of the poor and the vulnerable across the globe, those who have experienced what Walter Benjamin famously called the tradition of the oppressed. The Institute Professor and Professor of Linguistics, Emeritus, in the Department of Linguistics and Philosophy at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Professor Chomsky has written books that have ranged from his groundbreaking research into the nature of human language and communication, to his fierce analysis and criticism of international affairs and American foreign policy, from the Vietnam War to the present wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Since 1957, when he published Syntactic Structures, he has written over 90 books, including American Power and the New Mandarins, The Fateful Triangle, Pirates and Emperors, Manufacturing Consent, Middle East illusions, failed states, and most recently, hopes and prospects. There is no living American intellectual who has read more widely than him. Exposing the violent history of American imperialism, his writings have put before us the violence, the inequality, the economic and colonialist exclusions that affected and continue to affect so many human beings in the history of not only America, but of the earth. He reminds us that instead of celebrating the ideals of liberal democracy and of the capitalist market in an affirmation of America's expansionist desires, we should attend to the innumerable instances of suffering and death that often are attributable to this market and to these desires. What Professor Chomsky shares with Edward Said, beyond the events at which they both spoke together and the book on which they collaborated in 1999, Acts of Aggression, Policing Rogue States, is a commitment to scrupulous scholarship, a passion for justice, and the courage to say what others often do not dare to say. Seeking to delineate the consequences of America's imperial tendencies, and not only hers, what his writings tell us is that the earth is not a place where humanity or rights are shared. It is instead a place of inequality and injustice, a place of loss and death, a place where every day there are more people who are abandoned and abused, or displaced and dispossessed, who are marginalized and exiled, and who live without the full exercise of political and civic rights. It is a place where the task of defining and realizing human rights is infinite and therefore permanently urgent and necessary. This is why, if a different world can ever be inaugurated, if there can ever be a future that will not simply be a repetition of the past, it may well be enabled by work like that of Noam Chomsky. And it is for this reason, among so many others, that we remain indebted to him and to everything that he is. The title of his lecture this evening is I'm Kinda, Reflections on the Culture of Imperialism. Please help me welcome Professor Noam Chomsky to Princeton.
I always have to test the mic first. Can you hear me? Yeah? Okay. This is the third time that I've had the privilege of giving a lecture in memory of Edward Said. He was an old and close and valued friend, one of the most remarkable and influential intellectuals of the past half century. Much of his immense effort and talent was devoted to overcoming the insularity, prejudice, self-righteousness, apologetics that are among the pathologies of power and defending the rights of the victims. In these three talks, I've tried to pick up some of Edward's themes. The first of the three was in Beirut in 2006. That was shortly before the U.S.-Israeli invasion that once again tore much of the country to shreds. That was the fifth invasion in 30 years. The 2006 invasion devastated places that my wife and I had just visited. That added special pain to the scenes of destruction, where we had places where we'd been graciously welcomed during a rare moment of hope and peace, and of course to the deaths of people we had met. Well, perhaps I should comment on the phrase U.S.-Israeli invasion, which is not the usual one, but it's the accurate one. And it generalizes very broadly to Israeli crimes since the U.S.-Israeli alliance was formed in its established in its present form in 1967. Israel can go as far as the United States permits and no farther. Throughout, the United States has been a direct participant, even in crimes that it formally condemns, but with a wink. We see that regularly today. So take when Barack Obama repeats the standard official phrases about settlement expansion while informing the press that his statements are purely symbolic, was the word that was used, and that he will not administer even the light tap on the wrist that the first Bush did when he was annoyed by Israel's brazen defiance of the call for termination of these illegal actions. Let me stress, Bush was annoyed by the manner, not the fact of the defiance. And Israel recognized that and did it in a different way. For what it's worth, over 40 years ago, it was clearly recognized by Israel's highest legal authorities, that includes distinguished jurists of international renown, that the settlement programs violate core principles of international law. It's also recognized throughout the world outside the United States and affirmed by the International Court of Justice, but not really relevant when the world is dominated by a self-declared rogue state. On the 2006 invasion, President Obama's stance was quite explicit at the time. During his presidential campaign 2 years later, he highlighted his sponsorship of a 2006 Senate resolution insisting that the merciless attack on Lebanon must continue and that calls for ceasefire must be rejected until Israel is safe from the threat of Hezbollah missiles. Now, there had been no Hezbollah missiles, none, since Israel evacuated southern Lebanon 6 years earlier, but they were indeed launched in response to the invasion and the murderous bombing of Lebanese civilian society. Obama accepted without qualification Israel's justification for the invasion, namely that it was a justified response to the capture of Israeli soldiers on the border. That's a pretext that would be a little hard to take seriously under any circumstances, but in particular, in this case, in the light of Israel's regular practice for 30 years of kidnapping and killing civilians in Lebanon and on the high seas. It's piracy way beyond what anybody accuses Somalia of, often jailing them for decades, sometimes holding them as hostages, sometimes in secret prisons, all known but irrelevant, like the legal issues. In glaring contrast, Obama did not pronounce one word about the right to self-defense of Lebanese, Palestinians, or other targets of U.S.-Israeli violence. Understandably, one might say, there is no such concept as justified self-defense against our aggression, subversion, or terror. That's a core principle of the culture of imperialism, and of course it wasn't invented here. After a talk in downtown Beirut in May 2006, members of the audience gathered as usual just for informal discussion. And one young woman came from the group and approached me and said quietly, "I am Kinda." It was a startling, shocking moment, which gained further poignancy 2 months later as U.S. planes with Israeli pilots drenched the country once again with bombs. It was a moment that resonates since. It's hard for me to forget. Powerfully again last November 30th, for reasons that I'll explain directly. Well, Kinda knew that I needed no words beyond "I am Kinda." She had seen a book of mine that was